in the heart of New York City, where the towering skyline meets the sprawling greenery of Central Park, Keanu Reeves found a rare moment of peace. The world knew him as an action star, a Hollywood legend whose name echoed through theaters worldwide. But in this moment, away from the flashing cameras and blinding lights, he was just a man seeking solace in the embrace of nature. Dressed in a simple white t-shirt and a pair of faded jeans, he settled onto an old wooden bench, its surface weathered by time and countless visitors before him. He let out a contented sigh, watching the golden rays of the late afternoon sun filter through the leaves, casting dappled patterns onto the ground. In his hands, he held a small paper bag filled with unshelled peanuts. Before we dive deeper into this story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love stories like this, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow, we have another special tale waiting just for you. As he sat there, a curious squirrel scurried closer, its tiny nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Keanu chuckled softly, his movements slow and deliberate as he extended a peanut toward the small creature. Hesitant at first, the squirrel inched forward, its beady eyes locked onto the offering. Then, in a quick motion, it snatched the peanut and darted back a few feet to nibble on its prize. One by one, more squirrels emerged from the nearby bushes, their fluffy tails flicking with excitement. Keanu smiled, breaking the peanuts into smaller pieces to ensure each little visitor received its fair share. To anyone passing by, he was just another quiet soul enjoying a break from the city's relentless pace. But this serene moment was about to take an unexpected turn. Officer James Blake, a newly assigned park officer, made his routine rounds through the park's winding pathways. He took his job seriously, patrolling with a keen eye to ensure that visitors complied with the park's regulations. A recent city ordinance had imposed strict rules against feeding wildlife, citing concerns over animal dependency and environmental balance. Blake, a firm believer in structure and discipline, saw these rules not just as guidelines but as necessary measures to maintain order. From a distance, his sharp eyes landed on Keanu. The moment he spotted the squirrels gathered around the man, he knew what was happening. His jaw tightened as he picked up his pace, his boots pressing firmly against the pavement with each determined step. When he reached the bench, he planted his feet shoulder-width apart, his posture radiating authority. Clearing his throat, he spoke in a crisp, no-nonsense tone. "Sir, feeding the wildlife is against park regulations. I need you to stop immediately." Keanu looked up, his expression calm, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. He tossed another nut toward a tiny squirrel before turning his attention fully to the officer. His deep, steady voice carried an air of gentle wisdom. "I appreciate your dedication, officer, but these little guys look hungry. A small kindness never hurts anyone, right?" Blake's grip on his notepad tightened. He wasn't accustomed to being questioned, especially not over something as black and white as a park rule. His badge symbolized order, and to him, this was a matter of principle. No exceptions, he stated firmly. Rules are rules. Keanu's expression remained unchanged, but there was a quiet depth in his gaze, the kind that spoke of experiences far beyond the moment at hand. "Rules exist to protect, not to restrict," he said gently. "Sometimes, understanding is more important than enforcement." A few bystanders slowed their steps, sensing the subtle tension in the air. A young woman holding a coffee paused, glancing between the two men. A father walking with his son hesitated, curiosity flickering in his eyes. The atmosphere thickened with anticipation. Blake wasn't about to be challenged in public, especially not by a man whose face he now recognized. Keanu Reeves? The realization flickered across his mind, but it didn't matter. No one was above the rules. "I need you to stop," Blake repeated, his voice sharp and unyielding. His patience was wearing dangerously thin. He took a step closer, his presence looming over Keanu like a storm cloud ready to break. His fingers twitched as he reached for the small bag of nuts. Determined to remove it, his mind was set, end this defiance now. But at that exact moment, Keanu moved as well, reaching for one last peanut. Their hands collided. For Blake, it was a trigger, a split second of unanticipated contact. And before he could rationalize the situation, his training took over. His body moved on instinct, responding to perceived resistance. His arm shot forward, shoving Keanu back with a force that, though not excessive, was enough to cause the actor to stumble. Gasps tore through the crowd. A ripple of shock spread outward as people froze. Their eyes locked on the scene unfolding before them. For a brief moment, everything stopped. Keanu steadied himself, barely wavering, his expression unreadable. There was no flash of anger, no sharp retort, just a quiet, contemplative gaze that held steady on Blake, as if assessing him, waiting. Blake's breath came in shallow, uneven bursts. His heart pounded, adrenaline spiking through his veins. What have I done? The weight of the moment pressed down on him, thick and suffocating. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, his body rigid with tension. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Did that cop just push Keanu Reeves? That was uncalled for. Someone raised their phone. I got it all on video. Blake's vision tunneled. The realization crashed into him with the force of a freight train. He had acted out of impulse. And now all eyes were on him. The whispers turned to accusations, their words laced with growing hostility. His hands flexed, his muscles tight with something he couldn't quite name. Keanu's voice cut through the chaos, calm and steady. That was unexpected. Blake felt his composure slipping further. The control he prided himself on, the discipline he had built his career upon, was unraveling in real time. He could feel the tension burning beneath his skin, the heat of scrutiny pressing into him like 1,000 tiny daggers. I didn't mean, Blake started. But Keanu raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. His posture was still relaxed, his expression unreadable, but there was an unmistakable weight behind his gaze. I get it, Keanu said evenly. Instinct, training, happens to the best of us. Blake's fingers twitched again, his jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not like this. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Should we call someone? A woman's voice asked. He just attacked him, another muttered. That's assault, isn't it? Blake felt something dark stir within him. His muscles coiled, his breath shallow. His training told him to de-escalate, to step back, but another part of him, the part stung by humiliation, by the prying eyes of strangers, itched to lash out. He could end this right now. One firm command, one act of control, and he'd silence the crowd. He took a step closer to Keanu, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. You need to listen, Blake said, his voice a dangerous whisper. You don't get to challenge me here. Keanu tilted his head slightly, observing him. He didn't step back, didn't cower. Instead, he held his ground, his gaze steady. This isn't a challenge, Keanu said. It's just a conversation, but you're making it something else. Blake's nostrils flared, his fists curled tighter. He had seen this kind of defiance before. The quiet, unwavering kind that infuriated him more than shouting ever could. His body tensed as he considered his next move. If Keanu made one wrong step, one motion that could be interpreted as resistance, Blake knew exactly how to respond. A man in the crowd shouted, "He's gonna hit him." The words rang in Blake's ears. He saw it now, the recording phones, the expectant, judging stares. If he acted on this impulse, if he let his frustration take the wheel for even a second longer, he wouldn't just be enforcing a rule. He'd be crossing a line he could never step back from. A deep breath, a moment of clarity. Blake took a step back. Keanu exhaled, a hint of relief flickering in his expression. The moment had passed. The heat of it still lingered, but the worst had been averted. Blake forced himself to loosen his fists, to unclench his jaw. He glanced at the nearest phone still recording, then at the people watching, waiting to see what he'd do next. Every decision from here on would determine whether he could salvage this moment or let it spiral further out of control. I'm enforcing the law, he muttered, his voice lacking the steel it once held. It felt weak now, hollow. Keanu gave a small nod. And I respect that, but respect should go both ways. Don't you think? Blake didn't answer. He couldn't. The tension was still thick. But the moment for escalation had passed. He had nearly stepped into something irreversible. And Keanu, calm, collected Keanu, had been the one to pull him back. The crowd murmured but no longer seemed on the verge of outrage. People were still watching, still recording, but the intensity had lessened just enough. Keanu finally moved, bending down, retrieving the last peanut, and holding it out for a squirrel that cautiously took it from his fingers. The scene was surreal. A moment of peace, starkly contrasted against the storm that had nearly erupted just moments ago. Blake exhaled slowly. He had lost control, but he hadn't lost everything. And as Keanu straightened and met his gaze once more, Blake knew one thing for certain. This encounter had left an imprint deeper than any rule ever could. Keanu exhaled, brushing the moment off with a slow nod. "No harm done," he said, his voice steady. But Blake felt anything but reassured. His hands clenched into fists, then released. He had trained for countless scenarios, high-stakes altercations, unruly crowds, dangerous criminals. Yet here, in the middle of Central Park, he had made a mistake in the simplest of moments. And it had been witnessed by dozens of eyes. A mistake that could cost him everything. The weight of the encounter pressed down on Blake's chest like an iron vice. The low murmur of the crowd had yet to fully dissipate, their eyes flickering between him and Keanu. Waiting, expecting. He could feel their judgment, the silent condemnation radiating from every phone still raised in the air. Every whispered conversation. He had crossed a line. He had let his emotions override his discipline. Blake started, but his voice faltered, betraying the hesitation clawing at his insides. Keanu watched him carefully, as if understanding the turmoil raging inside the officer's mind. His expression was unreadable, calm, composed, but not indifferent. There was something else there. Something deeper. A quiet understanding. A challenge, perhaps, to see what Blake would do next. The uniform felt suffocating. The badge on his chest, once a source of pride, now burned against his skin. Was he truly upholding the law? Or had he just been blindly wielding his authority? And then, in a move that stunned everyone, Keanu extended his hand. The tension in the air shifted. A few people gasped softly. Someone whispered, "Is he really going to take it?" Blake hesitated. Every instinct in him warred against the simple gesture. Accepting it meant acknowledgement. It meant humility. It meant facing the reality that he had been wrong. That his judgment had been flawed. His gaze dropped to Keanu's outstretched hand. Steady, unwavering. There was no smugness in his expression. No silent victory. Only patience. As if he knew the battle waging inside Blake's head and was willing to wait. Blake swallowed hard. Then, with slow deliberation, he reached out and took Keanu's hand. The warmth of the actor's grasp was unexpected. Grounding. It wasn't just a handshake, it was a lifeline. Dissolving the invisible wall Blake had unknowingly built between himself and the world outside his uniform. "I'm sorry," Blake said, the words leaving his lips like a confession. Raw and unguarded. Keanu gave a small nod. His grip firm but reassuring. It takes strength to own a mistake. He held Blake's gaze, his voice carrying a quiet authority that had nothing to do with a badge. "You're a good man, officer. Just, don't let the badge weigh heavier than your heart." The words hit Blake harder than he expected. A lump formed in his throat. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to insist that rules were rules for a reason. But deep down, he knew, he had enforced the law. Yes, but he had done so without considering the human side of it. A sudden commotion from the crowd pulled them both from the moment. "Hey, let go of me." Blake's head snapped up. A younger officer, one of the new recruits, Ramirez, was gripping the arm of a teenage boy, who was struggling against his hold. He was recording everything. Ramirez snapped, his grip tightening. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," the boy shot back, his face flushed with anger. "I was just filming, like everyone else." Blake's stomach twisted. This was getting out of hand. The last thing he needed was another incident. Another unnecessary confrontation. Keanu took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "Let him go." Ramirez hesitated, eyes flicking to Blake for direction. The tension in the air was palpable again, teetering on the edge of something worse. Blake could see the way the crowd was shifting, murmuring, their attention shifting from him to this new confrontation. Blake straightened, inhaling deeply before speaking. "Ramirez, stand down." Ramirez blinked. "But, that's an order." A muscle in Ramirez's jaw tightened. But after a beat, he released his grip. The boy yanked his arm away, rubbing at the red marks forming on his skin. He shot Blake a wary glance before stepping back into the crowd. Blake turned back to Keanu. The actor studied him for a moment, then gave a small, approving nod. It wasn't much, but it meant something. The shift in energy was undeniable. The crowd, sensing that the conflict had diffused, began to disperse, though not without lingering stares and murmurs. Some still held their phones aloft, but the urgency had lessened, the danger of escalation averted. Blake exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. He had come dangerously close to making a mistake that could have defined his career, his reputation, but somehow, someway, he had managed to pull himself back from the edge. Keanu offered him one last glance, something knowing and unreadable in his expression. Then, with a small, parting smile, he turned and began to walk away. Blake stood there, watching him disappear into the shifting sea of people. And for the first time in years, he questioned everything he had once been so certain about. The badge still rested over his heart, but for the first time, he wondered, had he been protecting the law, or had he simply been hiding behind it? The rest of Blake's shift passed in a blur. He went through the motions, checking in with other officers, responding to minor disturbances, scanning the park's familiar paths, but something was different. His mind was no longer just on duty, it was on purpose. Each face he passed, each interaction he witnessed, felt heavier with meaning. He found himself seeing things differently, questioning not just the way he approached his role, but why he had chosen it in the first place. By the time his shift ended, exhaustion should have taken over. Instead, he felt restless, his mind a relentless loop of the day's events. He could still hear Keanu's words echoing in his head, that quiet reminder that authority wasn't just about rules, it was about understanding. It gnawed at something deep inside him, something he hadn't confronted before. Instead of heading home, he found his feet carrying him back to where it had all started. The path felt longer in the dim evening light, the park quieter now, its usual bustle softened by twilight. When he finally reached the familiar clearing, he wasn't surprised to see Keanu still there, seated on the same bench, now watching the sky as the last traces of daylight faded into a soft violet hue. Keanu didn't turn his head, but his lips quirked up slightly, as if he had expected this. "You came back," he noted, his voice light, unassuming. Blake hesitated for a moment before lowering himself onto the bench beside him. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "I've been thinking about what you said." Keanu remained silent, giving him space to continue. Blake stared ahead, watching as a few stray leaves danced in the evening breeze. "I joined this job to make a difference," he admitted, his voice quieter now, as if saying the words aloud made them heavier. "To protect people, to do something meaningful." Keanu turned slightly, his gaze attentive, but he still didn't interrupt. Blake let out a slow breath. "But today made me realize something. I can't just follow rules. I have to understand why they exist, who they help, who they hurt." He shook his head, rubbing a hand over his face. "I thought enforcing the law was about keeping order. But what if that order isn't always just?" A knowing smile formed on Keanu's face. "That's how real change starts." Blake's throat tightened. The truth in those words was undeniable. He had spent years convincing himself that authority and integrity were the same thing, that discipline equaled justice. But now, he wasn't so sure. For the first time, he questioned whether he had been enforcing the law or simply following it without question. He thought about all the times he had dismissed small protests, ignored the uncomfortable gut feelings that whispered that maybe, just maybe, the system wasn't as infallible as he had believed. How many times had he looked the other way when a situation didn't fit neatly into his understanding of right and wrong? Keanu shifted slightly, his posture relaxed, but his presence was anything but passive. "You know," he mused, "a lot of people go their whole lives without ever questioning what they believe. They just accept the way things are because it's easier than seeing the cracks." He glanced at Blake, his expression thoughtful. "But you're asking the right questions now. That's the first step." Blake felt something inside him shift, a deep, unsettling but necessary change, the kind that reshaped everything he thought he knew. He had spent so long defining himself by his badge, by the rules he upheld. But now, he wondered if true service wasn't about unwavering enforcement, but about knowing when to bend, when to listen, when to challenge the very rules he had sworn to protect. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the city's distant hum filling the space between them. The park, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, felt different now, less like a place he patrolled, and more like a place he had finally begun to see. After a long moment, Blake spoke again, his voice steadier than before. "I don't know where to start." Keanu chuckled lightly. "You just did." Blake let those words settle in. He didn't have all the answers. He wasn't even sure if he had the right questions yet. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. This wasn't just another shift. It was the start of something different, something better. Days later, Blake sat at his desk, staring at the proposal he had spent the last few nights working on. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as doubt gnawed at the edges of his conviction. Would they even listen? Would his captain see this as an overreach? Or worse, as an admission of failure? He thought back to the moment in the park, the tension. The mistake, the silent realization that had gripped his chest like a vice. He remembered Keanu's words, spoken not with judgment, but with understanding. Just, don't let the badge weigh heavier than your heart. That was the moment everything had shifted. Taking a deep breath, Blake hit print. The pages trembled slightly in his grip as he carried them to his captain's office. He knocked, steeling himself, then stepped inside. His captain, a seasoned officer with tired eyes but a sharp mind, glanced up. "Blake, what's this?" Blake swallowed, then set the proposal down. "A program," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty coiling inside him. "A way to foster better relationships between law enforcement and the people we serve. To bridge the gap between duty and humanity." The captain leaned back, scanning the first few lines. His expression remained unreadable, but he didn't dismiss it outright. "That was something. Go on," he said. Blake launched into his pitch, explaining how the initiative would pair officers with community leaders, create open forums, and implement training that focused not just on law enforcement, but on empathy. He spoke of trust, of understanding, of preventing moments like the one in Central Park from becoming routine headlines. By the time he finished, the captain was nodding slowly. "This is interesting," he admitted. "And you really think this could work?" Blake thought of Keanu, of the quiet moment on the bench, of the way he had felt that night when he'd finally begun to see his role through a different lens. "I do." Word of the initiative spread. Officers, some skeptical but willing, signed up. Community leaders cautiously expressed interest. And then, in an unexpected turn, Keanu Reeves himself reached out. His support wasn't loud or performative, it never was. Instead, he used his influence to encourage cooperation, lending his voice to a cause that now meant something personal. A month later, Central Park was alive again, not with tension, but with hope. The event, spearheaded by Blake, was unlike anything the city had seen before. Officers, once seen only as enforcers of rules, stood among the people, not to police them, but to listen. Children laughed as they watched demonstrations. Teenagers engaged in open discussions with uniformed men and women they had once feared. And families walked freely, unburdened by suspicion. Blake stood near the center of it all, watching the scene unfold. He had spent years walking these same paths, but never like this, never with this sense of purpose. Keanu appeared beside him, hands in his pockets, watching the community connect. "Not bad," he mused. Blake smirked. "You know, if you hadn't challenged me that day, none of this would have happened." Keanu chuckled. "I just fed some squirrels. You did the real work." Blake shook his head. "Nah, man, you changed the way I see things." The sun dipped below the skyline, casting golden hues across the park. The city continued to move, as it always did, but here, in this small pocket of the world, something had shifted, and all it took was a split-second mistake, and the courage to make it right. But Blake knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Because while one event couldn't rewrite the past, it could change the future. The question now was, how far could that change go? One thing was certain, Keanu Reeves had been attacked by a cop. But what happened after? That would shock the world. The story didn't end with a handshake in Central Park. The news of the incident spread rapidly, catching fire in media outlets worldwide. Headlines screamed accusations and speculations. Some called it police brutality, others, an overreaction. But what truly stunned the public wasn't just the altercation, it was what came next. Blake found himself at the center of something far bigger than a single mistake. The NYPD launched an internal review. And while Blake wasn't suspended, he was put under scrutiny. Every decision he had ever made as an officer was now being examined. Reporters camped outside the precinct, eager to get a statement. Protesters gathered, some demanding justice, others arguing that the system itself needed reform. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves, a man known for his quiet humility, did something unexpected. He refused to villainize Blake. In interviews, he spoke not of anger, but of growth. "We can't fix the past," he told one journalist, "but we can decide what we do next." His words turned the conversation from one of division to one of possibility. Instead of feeding the outrage, he redirected it toward change. The contrast between the expected and the reality kept the story alive. People weren't used to seeing this kind of response. It wasn't just another scandal, it was something different. And then came the initiative. Blake, once hesitant to step into the spotlight, found himself at the forefront of an idea that had taken root the night he sat with Keanu on that park bench. He wasn't interested in damage control, he wanted real, tangible change. With Keanu's support, he introduced a pilot program designed to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. Officers would participate in workshops, working alongside civilians to rebuild trust, not as authorities, but as people. Some called it naive, others, revolutionary. The first event was held back in Central Park. What had once been the site of a near-disastrous encounter was now a place of connection. Officers and citizens stood side by side, engaging in real conversations, not debates, not confrontations, conversations. Blake watched it unfold, the weight in his chest lighter than it had been in years. He knew this was just a start. A program wouldn't fix everything. A single event wouldn't erase the scars left by history. But it was something. Keanu, standing beside him, glanced over. "Feels different, doesn't it?" Blake nodded. "Yeah, it does." A few feet away, a young boy approached an officer, nervously offering him a drawing he had made. The officer knelt, accepting it with a smile. The boy's mother watched cautiously at first, then relaxed. Blake exhaled. "This is what it should have been all along." Keanu smiled. "Then let's keep it going." Not everyone embraced the change. Within the department, Blake's newfound perspective put him at odds with some of his colleagues. The idea that an officer could openly question the system without abandoning it was unsettling to many. He had been one of them, strict, by the book, unwavering, and now, he was proof that perspectives could shift. A few officers outright dismissed him. Some even resented him, but others, the ones who had felt that same unease but never voiced it, began to listen. And the public? They watched, some with skepticism, some with hope. The viral nature of the event that had started it all kept the story alive. And the more people saw Keanu and Blake working together, the harder it became to reduce it to just another controversy. The question remained, was this just a fleeting moment of reform? Or the start of something bigger? Months later, Blake found himself sitting in front of a new class of recruits. His voice steady as he spoke. "The badge isn't a shield to hide behind. It's a responsibility. One that only means something if you understand the people you're protecting." He saw a few of them shift, thinking, considering. Maybe some of them would forget his words the moment they stepped into the field. But maybe, just maybe, a few of them would carry it with them. He didn't need to change everything overnight. He just needed to plant the seed. As he left the academy that evening, his phone buzzed. A message from Keanu. "Proud of you. Man, keep pushing forward." Blake smiled. He still had a long road ahead. But for the first time, he wasn't walking it alone. And to think, it had all started with a single, split-second mistake. One that had shocked the world, but more importantly, had changed it. The more people saw Keanu and Blake working together, the harder it became to reduce it to just another controversy. The question remained, was this just a fleeting moment of reform? Or the start of something bigger? Months later, Blake found himself sitting in front of a new class of recruits. His voice steady as he spoke. "The badge isn't a shield to hide behind. It's a responsibility. One that only means something if you understand the people you're protecting." He saw a few of them shift, thinking, considering. Maybe some of them would forget his words the moment they stepped into the field. But maybe, just maybe, a few of them would carry it with them. He didn't need to change everything overnight. He just needed to plant the seed. As he left the academy that evening, his phone buzzed. A message from Keanu. "Proud of you. Man, keep pushing forward." Blake smiled. He still had a long road ahead. But for the first time, he wasn't walking it alone. And to think, it had all started with a single, split-second mistake, one that had shocked the world, but more importantly, had changed it.